Hello and welcome to the short assessment for learning question and answer session. So I'm here, Andrea Mapplebeck, one of the educators on the course. So thank you for taking part in the course. As always, I've learned a lot from people's contributions and from the different comments that have been going on in the threads in the steps. It's been really interesting to see what people have been talking about. Thank you too to the National STEM Centre, as always, for letting us host and run these courses, and Chris and Dylan for all their contributions to it. So without further ado, I have my pencil ready. You may want one if you want to make notes, but I'm going to go through the questions that have been submitted. So thank you for these. So we're going to start off. My first question, I think Matt has categorised these for us. Thank you, Matt. It's under a category called peer teaching. And this question comes from Michael. And Michael asks, what are your thoughts on the idea of learners changing role and becoming the teacher for the sections they have mastered? How can this process be assisted? So I suppose it's two questions there, Michael. It's what are my thoughts about the students becoming teachers, and then how can we actually support that process? In terms of students becoming responsible for learning and teaching each other, I think that's a fantastic thing to do. I was reading a book yesterday by Hattie and Shirley Clark, John Hattie and Shirley Clark, looking at visible feedback, which was really interesting. And they were talking about building a culture where students actually become responsible for teaching each other. I think one of the things for me as a teacher is, wondering about how do I manage that in case they're teaching each other things that are wrong. So I don't see that it's me not having a role in that classroom. It's me setting up the students who I know have got it. One idea that I came across, which was from Dylan actually on another question and answer session that we did, which I thought was a really nice idea. I don't know if you've come across using traffic lights in different ways, so students can either put a card down of a colour, or we can stack red, yellow and green cups, which are really cheap to get. I've got a class set of those for my students. And as the students are working, they can indicate, I've got this miss, just leave me alone, I'm absolutely fine, or I think I might need a bit of help soon, or come to me now. But what I can do as the teacher, because one of the key things in a formative classroom, and we've been pushing this on the course, is that I need to really be listening. Listening for understanding. Why are the students saying what they're saying? Have they got it? How do I know they've got it? And that's a really difficult question for a teacher to think about. Have they understood the learning? But what we can do once they have, and this was Dylan's idea, is we can walk around and we can put a blue cup on top, and that's something that the teacher indicates then to the rest of the classroom that this group of students, this pupil here has actually understood this idea. So why don't you go and talk to them first before you come to me? And that is a way of facilitating that learning. So that would help them do that, Michael. I think for me, it takes time to build a culture where students are willing to take on board various roles in the classroom. And I do think that's part of our role as the teacher in this formatively driven classroom, where we nurture a culture that errors and things that are wrong are something that we want airing and talking about, and that idea about building this learning environment, not a coverage environment. So I hope that helps. I'm all for it, but I think it takes time. We have to build a culture where they feel safe to air things. We need to model to them what a good teacher would do, how we teach something well, and it's not about standing there and necessarily spouting all the knowledge, but scaffolding that with questions and getting any learner to think. So we could ask the students, what's helped you learn today? And then when they're teaching each other, get them to take on board similar strategies. So we model and scaffold that for them. And as I say, I do like the idea of the little blue cup and me walking around actively listening. And I often walk around with a mini whiteboard or a post-it note, and I just write down key things that I want to draw out, or who's got it, or who's not quite understood it. So strategies like that to help me build that classroom. So also, Michael, there was several people, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to go back and see, who have replied to your thread. So Trevor replied and Irene replied. And I thought Trevor raised a really interesting point about the culture, about this. You need to be part of your own learning if you're going to learn, and learning theories back that up. I need to be active and cognitively responsible. I need to be doing the thinking. So I thought that was a really nice idea there from Trevor. I know that when I was a head of science, we used to have up, because we wanted to shift the culture so that the students knew that they had to be active in that learning, and we used to have up similar ideas that Trevor has shared there about the students having to do some of the learning and teaching in the classroom. That was part of the expectation from them. I used to get the students at the start of the year to sign a learning contract in their books, and we would go back to that, and it was like, what do you need to be the best learner? What do I need to be the best teacher? And together we would build up and work on that. So I think there's some lovely ideas there, Michael, as well, that you've had from others on the course. So please do go back when you've asked questions and see what others have responded. So thank you very much. Okay, moving on to our next question about peer teaching. This one comes from Ben, and Ben, again, you've had a reply from one of our own mentors, Jane, and I see that you've responded to that, so thank you. It's good to see that interaction on the course and that collaboration between us as learners. I'm interested in how the challenge of developing both effective hinge point questions and planning for differentiated activities that may follow could be informed by opening up the process to students themselves. For example, how could students authoring hinge point questions be used to develop them as reflective learners? Interesting question, Ben. I do think we've been asked this one before on previous courses that we have run. So there will be at some point answers there that Dylan and Chris have reflected on. For me, I think one of the key things about hinge point questions that we were trying to draw out in the course is as a diagnostic question, they are for a particular purpose. And they're really about whether or not our students, our pupils have understood the troublesome bits of the curriculum that we're covering. Have they got those difficult ideas? Have they got any of those misconceptions still? So we've done some teaching, but have they understood what we've taught them? Can I confidently move on as a teacher, knowing that all of the class understand what I'm going to do? So for me, I think it's more difficult for students to write hinge point questions if they don't know what that troublesome knowledge is. And as I work with teachers who are training to be teachers, one of the things that I want to develop in them is, yes, you need your subject knowledge, but you need your subject knowledge to know where the difficulties are for the students. And when they're saying particular things to you, what misconceptions is that showing you about the students? So it might be more difficult for our students. However, I was thinking that a way of helping scaffold our students to be able to do that, you might have taught some topics or be wanting to look at various concepts that we've covered that spiral in the curriculum. And you could give the students some hinge point questions if they know what they are and what they look like, and ask them if they can spot the errors. Might be a way to scaffold it for them first. So give them out some questions and say, can you critique these and tell me where you think the errors are and why they are the errors? And then could you create your own? So you could scaffold that process for them. I think it would be difficult for them to just do it without any support. So I might scaffold that for them. In terms of differentiating, once you've used the hinge point questions, I think a key thing that we wanted to come across is that our hinge point questions are planned in advance. So part of that planning process, and this is something we do go into on the Planning for Learning course, part of that planning process is planning for what might happen as a consequence. So I'm not just using a hinge point question and thinking, right, I'll just carry on with the lesson. I'm using a hinge point question and thinking, students who've got it, I'm going to move here. Students who haven't got it, I'm going to move there. If I've got a mixture, this is what I might do. So I'm planning for that in advance. And there are lots of different things we can do. If it's just a couple of students who've not actually understood the concept, I might move the rest of the class on, and then I might do a drop-in clinic with my students. I might do a drop-in clinic using somebody else who has got it. So that might be me drawing on the ideas we've talked about with Michael and Ben about peer teaching. I might get 2 students who've understood this idea to come and do a little bit of teaching with those who haven't. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. Or if it's 50-50, I might pair them up. If nobody's understood it, then that's really valuable feedback for me as the teacher to think, right, how am I going to go away and think about teaching this concept again in a different way so that my students understand it? Because what I've done this time hasn't worked for them. So I need to think about how I act on that feedback for me. So the other thing that I thought might help you, Ben, in terms of differentiation is that we have a differentiation for learning course that we also run, which has lots of ideas about how we can plan for the activities that happen afterwards. As I say, there's lots of different things that we can do. One of the things that we look at there is looking at hinge point questions and then actually getting the students to go and work in different quadrants in the room. So we'll split the room into 4 areas. It might be that somebody has not got it, so they need to go and practice, or that somebody has got it, but they need to go and apply, or somebody has got it and they might need to go and then compare and contrast and actually take their understanding deeper, or somebody might then go on to an extension activity and do an inquiry. So there's lots of ideas. That's just to whet your appetite of the things that we cover in differentiation for learning. And we show those ideas in actual classrooms with teachers who are using them day in, day out, so you can see what it looks like with the students and how they manage it. But the key thing for me is, yes, students might be able to write hinge point questions, but I think that would be difficult and take time. And then we plan for that differentiation afterwards, and there are lots of ways we can do that. So thank you, Ben, because I know that is something we get asked lots. So following on from Ben's question, we've got another question here from Carlos, which is also looking at how do we differentiate and use evidence from hinge point questions. So Carlos asked the question, how do I organise the evidence to achieving a level of understanding with very heterogeneous groups in knowledge? So Carlos, my thinking is that you're asking, how do I organise classrooms when I've got so many different ideas and starting points with my students? So if we have 30 students who have 30 different ideas, that's a big variety. For me, Carlos, I see that as a gift, as something that's really valuable. One of the things I do in my classrooms a lot is I regroup my students all the time. They know when they come in, if I'm starting a new topic, that they're not going to be sitting with the pupils that they were sitting with before. So I'm constantly spending time at the start of new topics, finding out where they are or asking what their thinking is, their confidence levels, and regrouping them. So I would purposely regroup them, Carlos. And then I would be getting my teaching activities where I'm getting them to work together, and I can do this idea of walking around and finding out what their thinking is. So it's very much that, using the evidence from the Hinge point question then to regroup them purposefully and plan for that in advance. I was reading the book that I mentioned earlier from Hattie and Clark this week, and they were talking about different jurisdictions across the world and how we see this mixture of thinking in the classroom differently. They talked about very much in Western culture, we sometimes see this variety in starting points as a big problem, whereas in different cultures around the world, they actually see it as a gift. And some of the highest performing jurisdictions, Finland, for example, it's illegal there to actually set students before 15. I think that's amazing. That makes me think, how can I actually use them? And this is one of the things that comes out of our formative classrooms, is that our teachers who are using assessment effectively are constantly regrouping students and getting them working as purposeful learning resources for each other. There's lots of research out there about cooperative learning approaches that we can use for that. So I would recommend going and looking at some Kagan ideas and how we actually get the students actively learning for each other. So it's not regrouping them and then just even, mixing them and saying, oh, you're working in a mixed group, but actually thinking, how do I make each person in that group responsible for the learning? So each individual would be allocated a role, or the structure of the task would mean that everybody's input was really important. I know that with lots of teachers I've worked with, they've found that higher attaining students who we think have got an idea, actually when we probe deeper, they've not got that understanding. So they can give us some shallow responses, but by getting our students cooperatively learning, they actually learn from each other. And our students who are higher attainers, actually, we can develop their understanding so it's deeper. So I would be thinking about using some cooperative learning strategies, allocating roles, getting all of my students responsible, telling my class, I need you all to air your thinking. Because it's when you all discuss these ideas that we end up with better learning as a consequence of it. And some of the strategies and ideas that we've talked about on the course have referenced that too, this idea that we need everybody talking. So with 30, I wouldn't be wanting 30 different groups. I might be grouping them in groups of 4. I might be grouping them in groups of 3. And then I'd be allocating roles within those groups, and I'd be managing it then across my 10. So hopefully that makes it more manageable for me as the teacher, and a better learning environment for my students who see that I'm constantly regrouping them. So yes, Carlos, it is difficult. If we try and teach 30 different lessons every lesson, we are going to kill ourselves. It's unsustainable. But if we see this gift that we have lots of different thinkers in the room and how we can nurture and use that gift and manage it effectively, then I think that becomes more powerful for us and also for our learners. And again, our differentiation for learning course also goes into ideas that will help you with that. So thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Ben, for those questions. So our next questions we've put under the category of timings and thinking about in lessons and across lessons. So thank you, Jane and Faisal. Jane asks, what would you regard as a good balance between teaching and formative assessment for, say, a topic that goes for 3 weeks, 3 lessons per week of 1 hour? And then Faisal asks, any established pedagogy for accommodating successfully the class discussion as a form of formative assessment in an already tight lesson plan? So we're looking here at how we can be flexible with time. Faisal is looking within a lesson and Jane is looking across a topic and how we cope with that. For me, I think it comes down to the fact that assessment for learning and what we've been trying to look at, this formative practice, is actually, it is the way of teaching. It's not distinct from teaching. For me, it is an established pedagogy. Inside the Black Box came out over 20 years ago now. And what they were looking at was how the best teachers are using assessment within and between lessons to help their students make progress. So for me, one of the key things is that we are flexible. There's lots of things that we talk about on the course, and there's lots of things we talk about on other online courses that are linked to this. And a key thing is finding out where students' starting points are. So even down in primary and early years, our children are coming in with ideas and thoughts already in all our topics, that they're not coming in with no knowledge at all. So one of the key things is that we find out what they know, and then we build our teaching and discussion points that Faisal asks about, at key points for us as a teacher to think about, how can I find some evidence out to respond to that? So the formative assessment actually is a philosophy and approach to a classroom culture that we build over time. And this is what they found with Inside the Black Box teachers. So they were clarifying what the learning was about for students, and they were finding out what they understood about that. And as we said earlier, when talking about what Michael was asking, they were considering all the time the inferences. What's it telling me about the children's understanding? They know nothing, right? So this is what I need to do. And then that responsiveness, including how do I feed back to the children and the pupils? How are they feeding back to me? What evidence am I picking up? So for me, if I was teaching a topic, I teach physics, and if my students are not understanding Newton's laws, and for me they're fundamental big ideas in the teaching and understanding of physics, then actually, if it's supposed to be in one lesson, but I find that they haven't got it, I will actually take longer. I will take longer. And what I found from my experiences and the teachers I've worked with is that if we pick out what the key ideas are in the curriculum and ensure that we're building those foundations for our learners, we can actually get through other things faster as we go through the curriculum later on, because they've got a sound foundation. They're not shallow in terms of their understanding. They've actually got that deeper understanding that we can move on. So for me, a discussion activity, I would be running it for a purpose, and I'd want to be finding out good quality evidence, as Dylan talks about our decision-driven data collection, thinking, why am I doing this? What is it I want to find out? Have I found out enough? Is that group of students over there contributing? What are their thoughts and ideas? Once I'd got that, then that would inform what I do next in my teaching. So I would be running it for as long as I needed to get good quality evidence to infer from. And with regards to Jane's question about the balance between teaching and formative assessment, I see them as the same thing. And as I say, I like to plan ahead. I like to see what my learning objectives are across a unit and think, what are the key ones that my students need to have? And if I need to be flexible, I will be flexible with the time I've got, but making sure that the fundamental ideas are ones they have. The other thing that we have as children get older is we can start thinking about home learning and what they're actually doing. I read a very interesting book recently that was talking about, as students get older, particularly they were talking about in teaching English, but I was actually reading a book about teaching physics, and they were saying as we get older, an English teacher wouldn't expect children to be doing the reading of the text in the lesson. We'd want to be discussing the text in the lesson, applying ideas from the text in the lesson, what are the key concepts. And he was saying that in physics, as we get on, students should be doing some pre-reading and finding out definitions and key terms. Actually, in the lesson, then we start applying those ideas. So we can think flexibly about the time that we've got. Obviously, we have set times with our students, 5 years in secondary, longer in primary. It's what can we do with them and what can they do with us in this culture if they're working hard. So there's no definitive answer, but I would be thinking all the time, what do they already know? What errors are there? What inferences am I picking up? How can I be flexible linked to those key ideas? And the big ideas for me are a key thing. And again, that comes back to subject knowledge for me as a teacher, knowing what the fundamentals are of my subject and how I ensure my students have got those. So thank you, Jane and Faisal, for those. Moving on next, we've got, and this kind of like links in, this is a question from Amanda, and Matt's put this down under the idea of adapting the scheme of work. We always seem to do the same type of routine. So Amanda's talking about English. She's saying 3 weeks of notes, reading, copying the end result as a poem, a story, a non-chronological report, and repeat. I'd love to see other ways that allowed for assessment to change these so they do not run the 3 weeks if not needed. Absolutely, Amanda. If the students have got it, we can either take their learning deeper, so we can keep within that same idea, but develop it deeper in different contexts. Can they apply it? Or we can move them on to the next concept in the teaching. We don't have to stick with it. A book I read by John Blanchard, Teaching, Learning and Assessment, I found a really interesting read. He was talking about a 5-year project, and I think that's really useful to know that assessment for learning, this formative practice, is not a quick fix. It takes time to build that culture. It takes time to get the children, the students, to buy into this active learning approach. And he was talking about a 5-year project that was run in primary and secondary schools. But it ended up that the teachers were giving the students the topic. This is the topic. These are the learning intentions for this topic. Traffic light, what you already know, what you don't know. Tell me what the evidence is for that. How could you prove it to me that you understand that? And then so the teacher was spending time at the start of a topic finding out what the children already knew. And then we can do all sorts of different things with our students to be flexible. We can regroup them often. Those students have got it, those haven't. Let's get them working together today. Or we can allow them flexible routes through the learning. In our Planning for Learning online course, we've actually got some examples of some flexible routes through learning that we've put up there. I think we've got some primary and secondary science and maths examples for you. You will see that the idea is that the learning intentions develop. Sometimes we can extend those learning intentions, sometimes we can consolidate them. The key thing, once I understand about the learning then, is thinking what activities and tasks do I need to do? And that for us is the point. Find out what the students already know. It's a famous Ausubel quote back in 1968, I think. Find out what they know and teach them accordingly. So we find out and then we teach them. And teaching them is also drawing on that repertoire of different tasks. So, Amanda, I think there are opportunities. I hope that gives you some ideas and more food for thought and places that you can go to read up on it. Thank you. Our next couple of questions are actually about questions. Obviously, we've done a lot of time on the course looking at questions. Questions is a powerful mechanism for us as teachers to find out what's going on inside our learners' heads. So Julia has a question. She says, I have lots of questions and feel a bit lacking in confidence in coming up with probing questions in relation to hooks that will get pupils thinking about the subject to be taught. So Julia says, for example, if she showed a video showing a line of geese following a man playing some instruments, the topic is ears and hearing. Okay, so the topic is ears and hearing. What would the question? Would the question be, what are the geese doing? Why are they following the man? Do they like music? How do you know that they can hear? Have they got ears? Where are they? Etc, etc. So there's lots of questions there that Julia asks. For me, Julia, I think some of them would work fabulously. It all comes down, I think, to what is the learning intention? What is the purpose of getting the pupils talking? What are you wanting to find out? I think your first question, number one, what are the geese doing, is a more closed question in the sense that they're following the man. But other questions that you ask there, I think, could really get them going. How do you know they can hear? Is a nice question to get our students talking. But it is, for me, it is very much about the purpose of the questions that you're asking. I think there's research out there that teachers ask a lot of questions. And one of the things that we wanted to get across in the course is that it's not that we don't want to ask questions, but actually maybe asking questions aren't the right thing to do if it doesn't fit with the learning intention and what I'm actually trying to find out as a teacher. So as a teacher, it comes down to me, what's the learning intention and what are you wanting to find out from your students? I think from what you've written there, Julia, you've got some lovely questions. So be confident and try them out and keep thinking, why am I doing the activity? Is the question helping me elicit the evidence that I need so that I can then move on in my teaching as I'd planned because of the purpose of what I was doing to help me with that learning intention for the children? I was also thinking, if you were looking at a topic of ears and hearing, if you could be asking children what the similarities and differences are with animals that hear in water and animals that hear in air. But I think your questions are great, Julia. Just keep thinking about why you're doing them and plan a question that helps you elicit the evidence that you need at that point in the teaching sequence. So thank you very much for that one. Moving on now, we've got a question from Sachiko. Sachiko asks, we learned about which approach would be better in our teaching context, hinge point questions or intentional dialogue. Teachers need to make a choice about either type of question to implement assessment for learning in the classroom. My question is, what standards or factors can determine teachers' choices? And then Sachiko references our step where we looked at the pupils who were learning about Pythagoras' theorem. And she says, in that step, in step 3.2, where we did a poll, she wondered which would be best for the context. She says the question is ambiguous. I don't think it is, but she'd love to know what to do to adapt. So again, this kind of like links to what Julia was asking. Both of our questions, and I think Dylan talks about this somewhere on the course, are diagnostic questions. They're questions that we plan to use to help us find out some evidence from our students. And we've talked about we want to decide when that is, that decision-driven data collection point. And we want to get good quality evidence. And that's why we're planning for our questions. Now, in terms of the two different types of questions, our intentional dialogue questions are at a point in the teaching sequence where we want to find out what our students think. What ideas have they got already? What do they understand about the topic? What errors are in their thinking? What are they bringing to the learning, as it were? So it's kind of a sit back and listen and find out what's going on so it can inform my teaching. Whereas our hinge point questions are a checkpoint for us as a teacher to see if we can now move on in our teaching. Have they understood what we've been teaching them? So for me, the Pythagoras question could be either way. It would depend on where I was using it in terms of that teaching sequence. So if students have covered Pythagoras, or I'm wanting to find out who understands about it before, it might be that I do it as a discussion question, which many people voted for on the poll. And I just walk around and listen to what they're talking about. And our extract showed us that our two children who were talking had some really interesting ideas about it. If I was using it as a hinge point question, it would be after I'd done some teaching on Pythagoras and I wanted to check, have they understood what I have done? And from that point then, as we've talked about earlier, I could differentiate or give students an opportunity to consolidate in their home learning or do some different teaching. So both are diagnostic questions. It would depend on where I was using them in my learning sequence and how I was using the evidence elicited. So with my discussion questions, I'd be wanting to find out what they were all thinking. And with my hinge point questions, I'd want to find out who I can move on and who I can't. So I hope that answers your question, Sachiko, and thank you very much for asking it. Our next question is from Tiritaake. This is underneath the category of explaining to colleagues about assessment for learning. So the question is, why do teachers find it difficult to understand what assessment means? Assessment for learning, in fact, a task designed for different learning paces of students in a classroom. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I spend a lot of my time working with teachers who are looking to develop their assessment practices, but sometimes messages get misunderstood or blurred, or sometimes people don't understand where they came from. So one of the things that we hope that you do on the course is go and work with colleagues actually and discuss and debate these things and go back to look at the research evidence. We do often throughout the course reference different research materials for you, which you might download as you go through and come back to later. I know that for me, I always say to teachers I work with, don't believe anything I tell you. Go away and test it out in your classroom and find out and see. But as we've said earlier, assessment for learning is really a philosophical approach to our teaching in the classroom. It stems, if you want to know, from learning theories that are around constructivism, so cognitive constructivism and socio-cultural constructivism. It's very much about the learner has to be doing the learning. So any assessment, and this for me is one of the key things, any assessment is just an assessment, and an assessment is not a test, and I think that sometimes blurs people's understanding. An assessment is an activity that helps us gather evidence, and depending on what we do with that evidence then turns that assessment activity into formative practice or summative practice. And our teachers who see that formative practice is at the heart of what they're doing all the time are constantly taking that feedback from their students, from the way that they're interacting in the classroom, from the way that peers are talking to each other, and they're using it to inform what they're doing. And I know that teachers are doing that all the time. The research evidence from inside the black box and that has gone on further give us 5 areas that our teachers who were developing formative classrooms worked. And it was around this clarity of learning and what quality learning looks like, which we cover on the Planning for Learning course. It was about feedback and the quality of feedback from student to teacher and teacher to student, and we've been looking at that. It's also about how we get peers working as learning resources for each other, and how we get talk going in the classroom so that we can find out what's going on. So for me, it's this idea, if we want to help colleagues, it's how are we finding out what's going on in our classrooms? What are we thinking about in terms of what that's telling us? And then how do we respond to it? And all of that, for me, encompasses assessment for learning. So it's not the assessing, it's the responding. And sometimes people say to me they use mini whiteboards, they use thumbs up, they use all of these different approaches, and that's assessment for learning. But the challenge is it's not if it doesn't impact on what I'm doing. And that's one of the key things that we want to come across. If I ask a question, everybody's got it right and I move on anyway, then I move on confident that they've understood what I do. If I ask a question and I get half the students know it and half don't, and I move on anyway, then that's not informed my practice really. So I need to be responding to the evidence I collect. And that for me, if we can get teachers to understand that, then I know that they're doing that already and they can share their ideas and take on board new ones. So thank you, Tiritaake. I hope that helps. As I said, there's lots of research literature that we reference. Do share that with your colleagues. So our next question, I'm going to move on to our question from David, which is looking at our use of hinge point questions. David asks, how would you go about explaining hinge point questions to a class? I tried one with one of my classes, but I don't think they really got what they were about. We've used them a few times now, and I think they'd be more engaged with their use if they had a concise, simple explanation. Other than that, they're working really well and I find them really useful. Thank you, David. Firstly, it's fabulous to read that you're actually trying things out. For me, one of the key things is that it's what you're doing, David. It's thinking about it and evaluating our practice as we're going along and how do we develop them and make that more. For me, with my classes, I explain to them why I'm using it. I say to my classes, I'm using this question here. I might not say it's a hinge point question. I might say I'm using this question here to find out if you've understood what I've taught you. And to see if you've got some of these areas that I know students in the past have found difficult. Because research tells me, and my classes used to say to me, oh, miss, not research again. But I used to research, oh, miss. But research tells me that if I find out what you don't understand and help you with that, then you're going to make better progress. So I say that to the kids. I'm using this to find out if you've understood my teaching, and if not, then I'm going to respond and help you. And when they see us responding, over time, they're going to see that actually it's really important to me that I get out good quality answers from you. I need honesty because I really do need to know if you've not got it. Then in time, they're going to see that, right, I need to tell Miss what I really do and don't understand. So I would explain it to them. I'm trying to find out if you've understood what we've taught. And if you haven't, then I need to do something about it. So we need to work together. And then obviously, as we said earlier, we need to plan for what we do. And sometimes I get my class going off and I do drop-in clinics and I get the children, the students who haven't done it to come and work with me. Again, on our Planning for Learning course, we give other ideas and I use this often with a hinge point question. I will get my class to do a 5-3-1 on how confident they feel. My 5s will go and work on their own and I will come to them later. My 3s go off and I come to them shortly and my 1s will stay with me. So you could 5-3-1 from a hinge point question. So I explain and then they need to see me responding to it. So hopefully they understand the purpose of it. So I hope that helps, David. Thank you. Our next question under this topic is from Shivani. Shivani says, I am working on writing information reports with Year 5. I have my planning ready to go, but after 2 lessons, I'm not sure if the class is ready to go to the next step of writing. My question is how to extend those who are ready for the next step. How do I use a hinge point question at this point? So in terms of your moving them on and using a hinge point question, it would be thinking, what's the troublesome knowledge you need to check whether they've understood or not? I can't tell you that because I don't know for you. And then writing a question around that, where every answer counts. I think that's an important thing about hinge point questions. Are they having difficulties? So they're my answers that tell me about the difficulties, or have they understood this concept? If you use a hinge point question, that will help you identify who to move on more confidently and who to do some work with. If they're ready to move on, there's all sorts of different things you can do. As we've said, you can get them to apply their ideas to a different context. We can get students to look at work that somebody else has produced. And I think it's Sadler talks about the fact that as teachers, we build up this thing called tacit expert guild knowledge. And that's what we really need our learners to have. And one of the best ways to get them to do that is to get them marking. So you could give them some work that had been mocked up by somebody else to see if they could mark it. Can they mark the work? And I know as a teacher myself that it's when I mark my students' work, I start to understand the things better because I know where the errors are, I know where the difficulties are. So you could extend the ones who've got it by getting them to do some marking, getting them to mark some mocked up work that either you've produced or you've got from a class who did this last year. And the ones who haven't got it, you can do some work on, or we've shared other ideas about how you could work with them. So I hope that helps, Shivani. the key thing is actually, are you confident that they've got it so you can move them on? If so, write a hinge point question to help you with that, and then different ways and ideas of that. So our next question from Cecilia, she asks, and I know, Cecilia, this is not just something that that English teachers think about. Cecilia says that one question we as English teachers always get worried about is, how can I design the best assessment for my SEN students? And I do think other teachers think that too, Cecilia. I know I've gone through similar thoughts myself. I am not an SEN expert, but for me, when I'm designing my assessment, and again, it comes down to, what do you mean by assessment? I'm going to think about assessment here, Cecilia, as questions. And, of how am I eliciting evidence or activities that are going to help me find out about what my students are thinking. So not necessarily a test. That's what I'm thinking that you're asking here. So for me, it's about ensuring that the assessment, the question or the activity I've designed is doing what I want it to do. If it's not, how can I give more clarity to my students so they know the purpose of the activity? So can they access the language of the question? Is it helping me elicit the right evidence? So it is that, we've talked about this on the course, that writing good questions is a continuing process. Is it helping me get the best evidence that I have? I know that with lots of my classes in, the years of my teaching science, in particular physics, I use a lot of activities like getting the students to draw posters or getting the kids to build models. I used to do a lot of model building. I would scaffold, these are the keywords I need the functions on it. But by getting the students to build models and talk about it, I was helping find out what their thinking was. So sometimes it's not even reading that the students have to do. They can actually do activities that help me find out about what their understanding is, that then inform my planning, which is what we've been talking about, form what I do next in terms of my teaching. I found some amazing misconceptions out from students by doing these things. And in science, doing practical work can really help me unpick what students' thinking is. So I see that as an assessment opportunity. In terms of English, obviously your students are going to be engaging in more written work. And again, as I said, I'm not a specialist in terms of that, but I would, if I were you, I'd be working with my colleagues and discussing whether the questions were doing what they wanted to do for us. Which questions worked particularly well, which questions helped us find out what we wanted to know, how did we respond to that. So I would be doing it collaboratively with my peers in my department so that we could help each other. So I hope that helps, Cecilia. It is a difficult question, but for me the key thing is it helping me find out what I want to find out from my students so I can respond. So thank you for that. Okay, so our last question here comes from Nagaraj, who is asking, it is always a challenge for a teacher to do formative assessment, as the process requires a lot of patience and knowledge regarding using different tools and techniques. Especially for student teachers, this is still more challenging. Framing a tool or tools for student teachers' performance in pedagogy of different subjects is really important, but how is it to be achieved in the midst of the lots of tasks to be completed? So that's interesting, Nagaraj. Absolutely, it is difficult. And as I've said, building a classroom that is formatively driven isn't a quick fix, but it is a way of approaching the whole way that I think about my classroom in its entirety. So we've said it's a philosophy and approach, and it's thinking, building up that formative toolkit. So I have lots of different ideas thinking, what do I need to do now? I think the kids are stuck. I think the kids are stuck. What do I need to do to find out why they're stuck? And as a more experienced teacher, and as you're right, it does take time, but it's thinking, do I ask a question here? Do I get them to talk to each other? Do I get them to have a go at constructing a model, or how am I going to find out what they're thinking? And it's developing that repertoire so I can draw on that and then respond to it. So it's not, for me, about sort of lots of tasks or tools. It's about being confident to be flexible, really, in the classroom and responding to my students. One of the things I do when I do CPD and working with teachers is I use a driving instructor analogy, because that for me embodies what formative classrooms and formative learning looks like. You know, when we're learning to drive, we don't learn to drive on our own. I don't know if that happens in other countries, but it definitely doesn't happen here. And when we learn to drive, our driving instructor is so important to have dialogue with us throughout the whole of our driving experience. And our driving instructor will take us on different journeys for different students. So they will find out what we know initially, and then they will today maybe take us down this particular road. They might want next lesson to try me down this road because there's a bump in the road and they need to see if I can cope with that. Have my students got a misconception? So for me, it's that responsiveness in time. It's thinking about how can I find out what my students know? How do I respond to that? And being flexible. And I agree. I think it takes time and confidence as a teacher for me to build up my expert subject knowledge to think, this is what I need to find out. Have they understood this? So what's the best tool to draw on for this? And being flexible in my lesson. And I've done it many times. I'm teaching and I find out that they've not understood anything I've done. So we throw what we were planning next in the teaching sequence out the window and we do something different. And that way we can stop and unpick thinking. I remember in my year 8 class, we were learning about trying to learn the fact that solids and liquids push back. And I found out whilst doing a practical activity that they all thought that gravity was, the gravitational field strength was less in water. So we had to completely change the lesson. So I think for me, that's the challenge. It's knowing what tools to draw on, but it's that philosophy of why I'm in my classroom and doing what I'm doing and being confident in terms of the learner's progress to sometimes go off piste and be flexible. So thank you, Nagaraj. It does take time. And as a teacher, you build up this repertoire. And that's why our online courses and all of the support materials that the National STEM Learning Centre provide are such rich tools for us, because we can't go to a banquet and eat everything. We need to keep coming back and seeing is it a buffet. So our online courses are there. They will run again. So there's key things that might be relevant for you in your teaching and learning at this point. And then the other stuff you leave and you come back to later. We develop our practice slowly. So we try one thing out, we keep evaluating it, we talk to our students, what's helping you learn, what's not helping you learn, what did I do that worked well. We talk to colleagues, which of our ideas worked well, which ones didn't, and we keep coming back. So do keep coming back to the National STEM Centre's online course suite, because that does keep developing. And as I say, courses do keep growing and we keep evolving them. Get colleagues to come and work with you on them. Download materials and go and talk to your colleagues about them. And also go and look at the National STEM Learning Centre. It is, again, a huge, rich feast of ideas. Pick out the ones that are relevant for you on your learning journey as you develop. So thank you very much, everybody, for all of those ideas and questions. We really value this opportunity and we really appreciate the questions you give us. We do, I know that Jane and Yasmin and our educators, we do value the comments that you put on, and we do go along and we do read those and respond to them and get you thinking and sharing, because we know that there's so much rich practice going on. I learned so much from you. And this gives us another opportunity to be interactive with you, because we want to model what we're talking about on these courses. So we do appreciate this. If there's any other questions that you've got, I will be coming back to this step in future weeks. So please feel free to add any comments having watched the video and I can reply to those for you. Thanks again to Matt, who always sits in the background and is a font of wisdom and helps support us with this. And to you and to all of our colleagues who work on the course. Thank you.